State of mobile, that's an interesting topic. I actually had a bit of a problem with this keynote. If you don't recognize my face from that newsletter that Ian was just plugging, and if you do, on behalf of your inbox, I apologize. But back to the state of mobile. So I was catching up with a friend a couple weeks ago. We were sitting in this restaurant in New York, and we were just noticing how many mobile devices there were around us. You know, every person in the restaurant had one, and they were in the waiter's pockets, and they were at the check-in stand where people were getting their table assignments. And it was really interesting to think about the difference between when he and I were in university together, which is, not that long ago, I won't date myself, but when we just didn't have mobile phones. And, honestly, let's do a show of hands. Who could find their way back home right now without using your phone? Okay, y'all are actually doing better than me because I just know my hotel is generally somewhere in that direction. But anyway, state of mobile. What is the state of mobile? It's rhetorical because we all know the answer here. Mobile has eaten the world. You can laugh at it. You can think it's not great. You can think this is the best thing ever. But the only thing you can't really do now is ignore it because it's everywhere. And here's some data to back that up. So this is a couple years old. If you follow me on Twitter for any reason, you know I'm kind of a data graph nerd. So I'm using it anyway just because I think this visual is so much more interesting than a standard bar graph. But the takeaways don't change, even if it's a couple years. This shows that globally there are now more mobile device subscriptions than there are people on average. So that means within a generation, we have seen the absolute global domination of what I think is probably the most exciting technological platform we've ever seen. And that's huge because domination is not the end of the story. It's actually, I think, the opposite. It means this is the bigger prize. We're just coming to the end of the prologue here, and this is no longer an adoption rate race. This is how to capitalize now that every adult human basically has a supercomputer in their pocket. This is how to capitalize on this super exciting platform and use that new toolbox as a way to meet customer expectations. And we know that apps are better for this. There's a whole raft of research. There's a couple numbers here we can look at it. 70% of digital time takes place on mobile. And of that, 92% of it is spent in apps. We can see it in the outcome data too. 3x higher conversion rates in app compared to mobile web. 4.2x additional product views. Like 3.5x higher lifetime value over time. I think I'm probably preaching to the choir. You wouldn't be here if you didn't already know this, but it's a huge opportunity. So when I think about the state of mobile in 2023, it's the end of the beginning. It's time for a new toolbox going into a new era. And the winners of this new game, they're already playing under a new set of rules. So that's what we're here to talk about today. Right, so if it's time for a new game, what was the old one? First of all, let's revisit the criteria for winning this game. Because when we get right down to it, the whole point of this game for pretty much every brand is just two things. Number one, making money, or number two, saving money. This is the reason why you would have a mobile app. But let's also review the game board, because you are not the only ones playing this game. We've got walled gardens out there, big platforms. At best, they don't care about you. And at worst, they would prefer that you were gone, because they are just not on your side in almost every case. And also, the board is shifting. Users are waking up to the possibilities of mobile, both for good and for not so good. We know that privacy is king now, and we know this because it is literally printed on the side of buildings. And users expect that theirs will be protected, but they also expect great experiences. This is something, especially now COVID has taught everyone that they can pull out an app and they can tap a few buttons and fresh carrots and lettuce will show up on the front door in 15 minutes or so. You're not competing against just good enough now. You are competing against best in class across the entire mobile ecosystem, and users don't have patience for things that don't work right. So if we think about how things worked before, getting users was pretty straightforward. You just had to convince them to download the app. And then once they'd done that, They were going to keep coming back to your app all the time because it was sitting on the home screen, staring them in the face every time they took the device out of the pocket. And the best way to do that was often install ads. So we've spent a lot of time and resources over the last few years basically renting someone else's users and then trying really hard to convince them that they were going to become our users, ads, third-party growth. In other words, this is the outsource your acquisition engine to someone else approach. And this was always a problem. This was always a single point of failure. This was always a case of misaligned expectations because these walled gardens that are you've outsourced to, their incentive is to keep the eyeballs with them. They're not really interested in sending them to you if they can avoid that. So this was a problem, single point of failure, and yet we didn't question it too much because mostly it still just worked. Now we've reached saturation point. The average people now have 90 or so apps. Show of hands, who thinks they have more than 90 apps on their phone right now? Okay, we have a self-selected group here. I have 344, and I know that because I checked right before the presentation. And I know I'm an outlier here. My wife reminds me of this every single time she sees me on my device. But I don't think I'm so much of an outlier. And the problem is, with that many apps on my phone, I'm not going back to them just because they're on the home screen anymore. I'm going back to them when they are successful because those apps are integrated into some broader experience that I'm having with that brand. Again, you're not up against good enough anymore. You're up against best in class. It's a different set of rules. But making that harder, there are imposters among us. By the way, who here played this game during COVID? Yeah, it kind of had a moment over in the States. It was quite a hit, and I remember watching their downloads. They just sort of spiked for months. And then I haven't heard much about this game for the last few years, but I checked the stats yesterday. They still have something like 40 million monthly active users. So they're still trucking along there. But back to our imposters. I think we've all sensed by now that the performance advertising life cycle has kind of sprung a leak, especially on iOS, but similar things are coming to Android. Ads just don't work as well as they used to. And because of this, the mechanics of the game are starting to change in ways that are not really very favorable to us. The walled gardens, they're going to be just fine, so don't worry too much about them. But for everyone else who's still playing this game, this is not great news. And then we also have economic softness. Depending on who you talk to, you could say this is a global trend, or maybe you've seen some of those articles that were calling this the app tracking transparency recession, and it just hit certain companies really hard. But the effect is the same because budgets are shrinking, and with marketing budgets drying up, it's more important than ever that when you're acquiring users, you're actually acquiring users who are going to do something in your app rather than just show up once. The install isn't enough anymore. And if we want to layer on one more trend here, it's a global shift in the attitude towards data. This is evolving. You still need data. Your first-party data, and your ability to act on it, that is your competitive moat. But data now also has liability attached to it. We've seen some of this in some of the regulatory moves in the last few months kind of around the world. But if data in the past, if controlling data was unambiguously an asset, now there's actual real risk involved. You have to manage this liability too. So you take this all together, and what it really means is the end of blank check growth. You can't just write a check and get more users and scale that infinitely. The new game is first-party growth. It's about growing via channels that you control, using resources you own, via products that are yours. So there is still I'm not advocating we get rid of advertising. Third-party growth still has a really critical place in this, and it always will. But you can't afford to just outsource everything anymore. And the good news is first-party growth is actually better on a lot of metrics. For example, owned and earned attribution shows that acquisition through these channels is up to 4 times better on something like a click-to-purchase rate. So the users you're getting, they are more valuable. And they're also stickier. If you're bringing users in through these first-party channels, the retention is significantly higher. So these users, they will do more in your app, and they will stay around for longer. You're selecting into a better audience when you do this. And the interesting thing, I think, is that these channels, first-party growth, these channels owned and earned, they were always important outside of mobile. But I think we often ignored them with apps because they were technically difficult to do. And ads just worked. The ROI channel there was a pretty tight feedback loop. So there wasn't really a need to go figure this out. And in some ways, bringing this to mobile is kind of going back to the future. Ads are important, but now is also a great time to be looking for other low-hanging fruit. So before we dive into some of the examples of how you can start playing this new game, let's look at a few examples of what not to do. So number one, I am not advocating for complete... There's a microphone there, sorry. I'm not advocating for complete abstinence on paid growth. I think ads have a really important place to play in this. They're reliable, they're predictable, and they're very scalable. You can quickly turn up the dial on an ad and get growth in a pretty immediate feedback loop in ways that other techniques are not. But also, I think it's a good time to reassess, because if you think about upper funnel versus lower funnel, just because of the way that last click attribution works, a lot of these paid UA campaigns, which are very low funnel, they're right there right before the install, they just got a lot of credit by default, probably at the expense of upper funnel things like brand advertising or even retargeting campaigns. So ads are not going anywhere, but this is a good time to reassess the relative investment of where you spend on them. The second thing not to do, ignore the workarounds. So I'm not saying ignore the workarounds. You shouldn't get distracted by them, because you could try squeezing juice from this old orange for a little bit longer. If you think about something like this device fingerprinting debate at the moment, that is an example of trying to squeeze more juice from this old shriveled up orange. And those might be temporary workarounds, but they are not going to last very long. And the sooner you commit to the new way of playing the game in this new world, the sooner you can stop pouring resources down the drain on something that won't be around for very much longer. I think another interesting example of this is I'm personally quite skeptical about data clean rooms. To me, those sound technically fascinating, but philosophically very close to something like fingerprinting. It's just an interesting debate that I've seen going on for the last few months. Okay, number three, don't play Russian roulette with the rules. And by this I mean, even if something is not being enforced, whether it's a platform policy or a regulation out there in some region, even if it's not being enforced right now, that doesn't mean never. When it comes to these things, it's not worth playing around. And also, it doesn't mean, even if it's not being enforced, that you aren't safe from some kind of PR disaster if your users find you are doing something that they consider to be a little bit off. Number four, be careful of companies that have incentives that don't match yours. And because what I'm talking about here is some of these really big walled gardens, they can change the rules kind of at any point. For an example of this, who's heard the term content fortress? Ooh, we've got one brave person in the audience here. Okay, for those who aren't familiar, the content fortress is this idea when a really big platform finds a way to move part of your user lifecycle inside their walls. So an example of this would be a Facebook-hosted shop, maybe, where in the past, you would be running an ad to send a user to download your app and purchase something inside your app. Now with a content fortress model, what Facebook is saying is we will give you tools inside the Facebook app, and your customers can buy there instead. So basically, the situation here is kind of a Machiavellian one, because they've basically said you can pay for your users, but you don't get to take them with you anymore. They're going to stay here with us. So be careful of places where something could change the rules really quickly like that. And number five, just be sincere with your users. Don't try to trick them with things. You can do some things to sort of juice these metrics. You can boost a short-term gain thing. But remember the long-term goal. It's make money or save money. And if you do something short term, you could end up sacrificing those users longer term, which would be not good. So what should you do instead? Well, that's the rest of the day. So we have a lot of good conversations around that, but some themes to keep in mind as you get started. Look for places where you can find what I'm calling investable growth. So these are things where you invest once up front, and then the benefits over time are compounded. There's no marginal cost. So an example of this would be if you write SEO content, and then you manage to get that to rank in Google. That is a great way that you're just going to continue harvesting from that investment for a really long time, versus something like an ad where if you turn it off, it's pretty much gone almost right away. A good example of investable growth, if you can find a way to build it into your product. Viral loops, when they work, are really powerful. Things like content sharing or referral programs. These are really interesting, and they often work quite well for many apps. Number 3, upgrade your existing users. So you probably have some data showing the relative value of a user on desktop versus a mobile web user or a mobile app user, or maybe even if you're very sophisticated, you'll have something that shows the value of a user who's omni-platform. They're interacting with you everywhere. If you can find ways to consistently upgrade your users to a place where they are more valuable, that is a great thing. Look for those. Next, fix the leaks. So this one's, I think, pretty straightforward, but if you're spending time and resources pouring users into the top of your funnel, and you've got a great big hole at the bottom of the bucket, it's a lot harder to make that justification now that the paid ads acquisition lifecycle is starting to dry up. If your marketing emails don't deep link and you're losing users out the bottom, that's probably a good place to start. Ad creative. So again, I'm not advertising that we should completely get rid of paid growth. But if you're going to continue to invest in it, improving your ad creative is actually a really good place to start. This outsource your acquisition engine approach that has been working for many years could usually find users that were going to be a good match for you, even if the ad creative wasn't ideal. And now that that outsource your acquisition approach is starting to shrivel up, we've seen a lot of companies find that they can bridge some of that gap by improving their ad creative. That kind of does the targeting on your behalf. And one thing that I think is going to be fascinating is we see this new generative AI thing come on the scenes. That is basically infinitely scalable ad creative. So I'm going to be really interested to see how these big platforms integrate that sort of thing. And lastly, embrace the new measurement reality. At this point, it's pretty clear that user-level identifiers are going across the board, they're going away. Whether it's third-party cookies, IDFAs on iOS, GID on Android, this idea of a name tag that you can stick on a user and then everyone else in the ecosystem can read it, that just isn't going to last very much longer. And this means we need new muscles. I think we'll start to see a distinction between measurement that works in one channel versus measurement that helps you see all of your channels holistically together. Media mix modeling is something that's getting a lot of airtime around that. I think there are some promising results there, but this is where we're going to see a lot of innovation over the next few years. So let's rewind and do a quick highlights reel. Mobile has eaten the world. This means that the prize out there is bigger than it ever has been. But there are monsters in the ocean. Not all of them are on your side. You're not playing this alone. So the techniques that we've used in the past to drive app growth are not as effective as they used to be, and that means it's time to go play a new game. It's time for you to own the destiny of your own app. So if you take nothing else away from today, if it's one of your 3 things, make it this. Yes, the winners are playing a new game, and we are the winners, the ones of us in this room. It's you, it's me. We're here learning about this. And the world of mobile is a world of huge possibilities. So let's get started.